So our inherent right to self-rule or self-determination stands on its own legitimacy. It is not dependent upon Canada. It stands on its own. That is where we start. And when we dealt with negotiations, for example, in the Charlottetown Accord, I had to deal with different fears that groups had, that provincial governments were fearful of losing their power over their lands and their resources if they recognized our right to make laws about lands and resources in our territories. The federal government was concerned about if they recognized the inherent right, it would impair Canadian territorial integrity, it would impair Canadian sovereignty. That's where you start. Keeping what you have, and that's where we start keeping what we have. So the challenge is there. It's not an easy task to come to an understanding about how we're going to coexist, how our respective nations are going to live together.
So what we did that really kind of changed our course, of course, was our Constitution. So the Haida Nation has a Constitution that basically sets it all up. Like, I'm the president of the Haida Nation. I speak on behalf of all Haida people. And that's a very big step for us, because even though we're on an isolated island, the territorial overlap issue is something that is still an issue that we have to manage in Haida Gwaii, because we do have all of our clans, we have all of our traditional territories. Everybody has their interests of what they want, for their own people. But what made it all stick and what made it all work was was a document and agreement that's called the Haida Accord. So the Haida Accord is a document where all of our hereditary leaders of the Haida Nation sign a document that says, we agree that we're going to unify and we're going to go with one voice, one approach, and one strategy around trying to settle the land claims issue.
When we're talking about Indigenous assertions of jurisdiction, we have to recognize that for a long period of time now, virtually since Confederation, that assertion of jurisdiction has been grossly interfered with by the government of Canada. And as a result, the ability of Indigenous communities to experience the evolution of that jurisdiction, the evolution of leadership, the assertion of leadership, the natural growth of leadership has been stymied by federal government action.
We know what our language and culture and traditions are within our territories. We've never lost that. It's Canada that's never understood it and never really become a part of it. Once they do that, then we can move forward.
When we look, for example, at the issue of residential schools, you cannot commit an atrocity like that and expect its impact to be resolved in a few days or a few weeks or a few months or a few years. And you cannot believe that the simple utterance of "I'm sorry" actually begins to redress or address the extent of the problems that have been created. And I now spend much of my time trying to explain to governments why their thinking has to become far more radical than it has ever been. And of course, large institutions don't like to hear that and are quite prepared to dismiss it. But we do need to understand that the degree of institutional change that's required is dramatic. Symbolic gestures of reconciliation are important, but they are not enough. They are simply not enough. It is going to cost us a lot of money and a lot of willingness to change in order to create equal governance. The question is, when are governments going to actually move? And when are they going to realize and recognize that it has to be done on the basis of equality? It can't be done on the basis that says, we'll give you what we think you're worth. That is simply not acceptable. I think it's unconstitutional. I just think we have to start setting some yardsticks so that we're not just saying the same things over and over. We can actually see some signs of real improvement as we go forward. Thank you very much. Miigwech.
That reconciliation, I think, always has to be kept in mind, that it is not the first step or something we need to have in order to move forward. It is the deliverable that comes from achieving the other actions first. So you have to fix all of these problems that have been laid out, things like this, all of these the fiscal relationship. You have to talk about boil water advisories, you have to talk about murdered and missing Aboriginal women, and once you start fixing all of these things, reconciliation is the end product that comes from receiving all of that. It is ongoing. And so I think that's really important to keep in mind when we're talking about how to move forward as a country.
I said that this is now more than a decade's worth of audit showing that programs have failed to effectively serve Canada's Indigenous peoples. All of the studies, reports, conferences, audits, list of obstacles, and list of success factors are very nice. But for any of them to be useful, they have to operate in an environment that has mostly been missing the one resource that is needed: a problem-solving mindset. Until a problem-solving mindset is brought to these issues to develop solutions built around people, instead of defaulting to litigation, arguments about money, and process roadblocks, this country will continue to squander the potential of much of its Indigenous population.
Again, it's about jurisdiction, access to land, access to capital. So committing to a nation-to-nation relationship involves rapidly increasing fair settlement of First Nations land claims and resource revenue sharing agreements, and looking at what RCAP recommended, increasing Indigenous people's land base is essential to creating wealth that can further social outcomes for communities.
We have a lot of work to do. Aside from everything that I spoke about, I must tell you that the one thing that we didn't highlight a lot in the notes today was the importance of our culture and our community. You see, I think that there's something to be said about our people being able to sustain themselves, to be able to survive, since time immemorial. To travel vast, brutal landscapes and to be able to carry on from one generation to the next with language, with culture, with a sense of pride. The work that we're doing at the Chiefs of Ontario, just very quickly, the vision is there, but we're finding it's important to continue to be at the table. We sit at the AFN level. I'm an executive member there, and we're continually discussing these issues and bilateral with Canada, fiscal relations, the law and policy review. These are things that our executive is talking about. But I think we have to drill down even further, and we need to get to the history of who we are, and we have to go back to the relationship, and we have to correct some of those things, and we have to dispel some of the myths that exist about who we are and what our rights are and what our authorities are. Ultimately, we are responsible. And once that door opens up and we can create those institutions, I think life will get better for our people.
And I think that, there's things that we can look to. People are asking now, well, how do we move forward from here? One, it's correcting the systemic underfunding, but the next part is developing a plan. And people are asking, what is the government's plan? We've heard that they're changing the department, but what is the rest of the plan? The Royal Commission report from 1996, did set out a plan. Maybe it needs to be looked at, but it did send out a fairly detailed, specific, comprehensive plan about how to move forward. That if we're going to be moving to self-government, we need to have that capacity building and supports for First Nations to start creating their own constitutions and creating their own laws and revitalizing their Indigenous laws. And I think that is really key to this moving forward and will create these healthy, educated, employed individuals as well.
You know what? When you actually do business with Indigenous businesses, do you know what they do? They hire Indigenous people. They actually train them. We have other big businesses around this country, and they're struggling to figure out how do you hire Aboriginal people. Our development corporation, we have 400 people at the height of our season, and we hire our own people. Small businesses, the majority of Indigenous small businesses are about 2 to 3 people. Who do they hire? Of the 2 to 3, 1 is Indigenous. And that's not the owner. They're hiring somebody else as well. I've always said if you want to deal with issues of Indigenous unemployment, support Indigenous business, because they're going to go out, they're going to train the people themselves, or they may get some support for training, but they're the ones who are going to hire Indigenous people.
When Indigenous people really get to the point where something of real substance is happening for our future. We're in the place where we're supposed to be. And the other thing was, we need to be an order of government in this country. There are 2 orders of government, but we need the 3rd one, and that's us. And the other thing was that we need to have, we said, maybe a parliament, Aboriginal parliament in Ottawa. And when we reach that, then it will be time to have the proclamation that we talked about and accompanying legislation for each province to enact.
And the fastest way to do that, I think, is to look at the 94 calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They came from the biggest canvas of recorded statements from Indigenous people. We'll help people know exactly where they fit into that work, what we have to do to establish respectful relationships between and among ourselves, and what we have to do working together to undo the harms of the past.
So what we need now is capacity development and institutional support to allow us to function in the world as we understand it today.
Governance is acting on that sovereignty and getting organized, developing your vision, implementing it.
But I think the ultimate outcome has to be Indigenous nations living as Indigenous nations, with governance, with language, with culture, all contained, so we can take care of ourselves and our own lands and resources.
In the more simple sense, it's in a legitimate and functional way, each of us making decisions over our well-being.
But we're not saying, for example, the Métis Nation, that in terms of health, that we want to have our own health system, that we want to have our own hospitals. But what we want to say is, because we are citizens also of the provinces, that's our reality. We want to have enhanced services. We want to have dedicated services. We want to ensure that our people, get the service that they deserve. And that's in a lot of cases across the board. But in key areas, we want to ensure that we do our own delivery of the services that we can feel comfortable in providing.
There's also work to do on the nation side to figure out what cluster, what group of people see themselves as a nation, but I think we're ready to do it. I think it's about attitude more than anything else. Do we want this to work or not? And I think our government is attitudinally correct.
So we understand that we have to know that as Indigenous people we have both territorial and personal jurisdiction, the right to govern over our lands and also over our people, regardless of where those people are. So when we talk about being Tunaqa, it's not a reserve or a place-based identity. It's in our hearts. When we ask someone to think, we say, it means to ask your heart, not your head. So when we talk about governance for ourselves, we have to know, who are we actually talking about here? The Indigenous nations? That's one relationship. So we have to then ask nation to nation to nation to nation, because there are many nations in Canada.